Hello, everyone. So, I'd like to introduce this in the sense that I am going to be recording a video for not not my astrology channel, which has somewhere over 300 viewers, which is still a fairly modest number of amount of following for astrology channel. I'm posting this on my other channel, which only has about 33 followers, I think. And the last video I recorded on this channel, I don't think has gotten any views. So it's kind of questionable, I think, what the hell is going on with. There's something about the return that I get into investing energy into thinking about an idea or a concept for a video and how that translates into views. And this channel is not doing very well, but nonetheless, I'm going to do something different for this channel and just see how it goes. And I will be reading aphorism number 356 from the Gay Science. And I have to say that I've been reading this book for the first time, and I've only read one other Nietzsche book aside from this. And I'm not a philosophy scholar or an academic or anybody who has any sort of expertise on philosophy. Um, I'm approaching this as an amateur who's reading this stuff for the first time, and keep that. So I'm not. This may be somewhat amateurish. Okay, maybe I don't need to apologize too much, but I'm not. I'm not attempting to position myself as somebody who I'm not a Nietzschean who has any sort of expertise, a philosopher. I'm just tackling it and dealing with it. But I thought, anyways, that there's also this kind of association, obviously, a certain relevance where it comes to a climate around things to do with Jordan Peterson. For example, I did a couple of videos on this channel about Dostoevsky, and there's this whole. I have to admit that I'm not a follower of Jordan Peterson. I'm not a fan of Jordan Peterson. I'm basically a hard leftist. But I do the thing about this thing. There's something about this certain cluster of material that Jordan Peterson draws from to highlight the problems of our social ills, and I think that Carl Jung also taps upon this in The Undiscovered Self. And so it's a certain, I'm kind of making a concession to people that I otherwise wouldn't agree with, in that perhaps in a sense of the Jungian kind of integrating the shadow, what if the conservatives do actually have a point, right? Or what if, as much as I don't like Jordan Peterson, maybe this is a concession to that kind of stuff. But first I'll read, with that as an introduction, I will read this and maybe comment on it afterwards. It's not that long. So this is aphorism 356 from the Gay Science. It begins like this: how things will become ever more artistic in Europe. Even today, in our time of transition, when so many factors cease to compel men, the care to make a living still compels almost all male Europeans to adopt a particular role, their so-called occupation. A few retain the freedom, a merely apparent freedom, to choose this role for themselves. For most men, it is chosen. The result is rather strange. As they attain a more advanced age, almost all Europeans confound themselves with their role. They become the victims of their own good performance. They themselves have forgotten how much accidents, moods, and caprice disposed of them when the question of their vocation was decided, and how many other roles they might perhaps have been able to play for now it is too late. Considered more deeply, the role has actually become character, and art nature. There have been ages when men believed with rigid confidence, even with piety, in their predestination for precisely this occupation, precisely this way of earning a living, and simply refused to acknowledge the element of accident, role, and caprice. With the help of this faith, classes, guilds, and hereditary trade privileges managed to erect those monsters of social pyramids that distinguish the Middle Ages and to whose credit one can adduce at least one thing: durability. And duration is a first-rate value on earth. But there are opposite ages, really democratic, where people give up this faith and a certain cocky faith and opposite point of view advance more and more into the foreground. The Athenian faith that first becomes noticeable in the Periclean age, the faith of the Americans today that is more and more becoming the European faith as well. The individual becomes convinced that he can do just about everything and can manage almost any role, and everybody experiments with himself, improvises, makes new experiments, and enjoys his experiments, and all nature ceases and becomes art. After accepting this role faith, an artist's faith, if you will, the Greeks, as is well known, went step for step through a rather odd metamorphosis that does not merit imitation in all respects. They really became actors. As such, they enchanted and overcame all the world, and finally even the power that had overcome the world. For the graceless histrio vanquished Rome, and not, as innocents usually say, Greek culture. But what I fear, what is so palpable today, that one could grasp with one's hands, if one felt like grasping it, is that we modern men are even now pretty far along on the same road. And whenever a human being begins to discover how he is playing a role and how he can be an actor, he becomes an actor. With this new human flora and fauna emerge that could never have grown in more solid and limited ages, or at least they would be left there below under the ban and suspicion of lacking honor. It is thus that the maddest and most interesting ages of history always emerge when the actors, all kinds of actors, become the real masters. As this happens, another human type is disadvantaged more and more and finally made impossible. Above all, the great architects. The strength to build becomes paralyzed. The courage to make plans that encompass the distant future is discouraged. Those with a genius for organization become scarce. Who would still dare to undertake projects that would require thousands of years for their completion? For what is dying out is the fundamental faith that would enable us to calculate, to promise, to anticipate the future in plans of such scope and to sacrifice the future to them. Namely, the faith that man has value and meaning only insofar as he is a stone in a great edifice. And to that end, he must be solid, first of all, a stone, and above all, not an actor. To say it briefly, for a long time people will still keep silent about it. What will not be built anymore henceforth and cannot be built anymore is a society. In the old sense of that word, to build that, everything is lacking, above all the material. All of us are no longer material for a society. This is a truth for which the time has come. It is a matter of indifference to me that at present the most myopic, perhaps most honest, but at any rate noisiest human type that we have today are good socialists believe, hope, dream, and above all shout right almost the opposite. Even now, one reads their slogan for the future free society on all tables and walls. Free society, yes, yes, but surely you know, gentlemen, what is required for building that. Wood and iron, the well-known wood and iron, and it must not even be wooden. So after having read Carl Jung's Undiscovered Self and being familiar with Carl Jung's criticism of Nietzsche and stuff like that, and the influence of this kind of Nietzschean strain of thought on Jung and his followers, and out of this, there's certain psychological ideas, such as what we would call individuation, but as well as the need for authenticity, basically. And so the thing about authenticity comes in with this, because there's authenticity is basically characterized in contrast to the false consciousness of modern society, right? And the false consciousness has been basically diagnosed by Nietzsche here in the gay science as a kind of act that's put on at the kind of theatrical performativity of the elites, where everybody is kind of so identified with the role and the costume that they put on that it's kind of like it's the false ego that has that this sort of Western spiritualism emerges out of this, that the idea that we have become we're like the Matrix thing, right? That we're lost in a fake world, a matrix, and that we need to find the authentic by destroying the ego and then coming back into our authentic truth of what is going on. But it seems to be that this is not so easy, or that the false consciousness keeps perpetuating itself in such a way. And basically, as I see it, the way I interpret this is that of course, what characterizes the time period of Nietzsche is that obviously after Nietzsche was around the 19th century, in the turn of the 20th century, a lot of changes happened around technology, and then World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression and all those kind of stuff. Nietzsche is often falsely given a bad reputation of being parts of his philosophy being incorporated by the Nazis, but Nietzsche himself was not a Nazi. Apparently there's evidence going around that Nietzsche was actually Polish, and that Nietzsche has said plenty of things against anti-Semitism and all that. The point, though, is that the authenticity versus a performance or whatever, there's some kind of... It's odd to me that after this terrible trauma of World War I and World War II, and this terrible destruction and all this kind of stuff, that in the aftermath, there's a new technological society, and yet when we think about what the 1950s were like, I'm confused about the sort of conservative ideal of the 1950s, because the 1950s are something that is a very new thing that feels sort of fake and artificial, like the way that 1950s advertisements there's a certain kind of obvious feel of inauthenticity about it, like it's a constructed image, like an advertising thing, and that there's something fake or false or phony about it. And then even the problem about this too is that historically, coming out of this, that even things like let's say the hippie movement have had a certain doubt cast upon them that this was actually just engineered by the CIA or something like that. Like Jim Morrison's dad was in, there's all that kind of stuff, right? But maybe I'm getting off track here. The point is is that there was a what ended up the machinations of history. Communism and fascism eventually were defeated, and what came to prominence was what is known as neoliberalism or neoconservatism, right? And what this basically does is try to, in the whole tumult of modernity, there is a basic frustration or resentment towards the precursor to what is now considered the professional managerial class, right? And last year, I did a bunch of therapy with a guy who specialized with some of the stuff that I was interested in called internal family systems therapy. And one of the most shocking things that I discovered by acquainting myself with this, I mean, I'm kind of playing coy because I actually was exposed to this a little bit more from some other people that I worked with. Use some of these IFS ideas, but one of the main ideas is that instead of just having a central ego, is that actually if you pay attention to what's going on in the ego, a lot of what the ego, or what is defined as the false self and spirituality, is actually defined as the internalization of the professional managerial class, basically, right? In that there's a certain false consciousness, the matrix false consciousness that is created is basically there because we are socially conditioned into a kind of a corporate society, where even the family exists as a mode of social reproduction to produce people into being good workers who are then inserted into a corporatized pyramid hierarchy where success means to graduate into a ladder climbing managerial structure, right? And so because this is, in most cases, if you look at America, the largest employers, places like Walmart, Home Depot, aside from like the military, the biggest employment opportunities are jobs that are places like becoming a middle manager for some sort of large box store retail operation, right? And so because this is the brass tacks of the world that we live in, that Carl Jung would say that the ego, rather than being destroyed, has to be something that is there to function in society and to be able to, politely greet customers, provide good customer service, all this kind of stuff, wear the uniform, but there's a certain repression of all the things that would be unprofessional and that unpolite and all this kind of stuff. And what I find is interesting is that when it comes to the family dynamic, is that because we are all conditioned, basically the home is basically the place where we rest, we recover, and people reproduce and have children to provide the economic workforce with more labor, is that we're in our family, internalized family is internalizing managerial structures in the same way that, like, imagine if you had a large family dinner and you had all your in-laws over and you had a whole bunch of people that had different political points of view, different attitudes. Not everybody is there because these are necessarily the people that they would prefer to spend time with, but because this is a family and it includes all these diverse range of people or whatever, that there's some kind of this is what Slavoj Žižek says, is that Slavoj Žižek cautions against this need to make everything authentic, because if you can imagine what I'm describing as like a family dinner where you've got a diverse range of different family members, some of whom may have political beliefs that clash, that it could be more authentic to have like a debate where you like get into what the clash of opinions is, and you argue it, but that would ruin the dinner for everybody else, and people would probably lose their appetite, get frustrated with each other, start drinking too much, somebody goes home early, there's all sorts of things that could play out, where in order to have a more a better time, there's certain you don't talk about politics or religion or any this kind of stuff at the dinner table, and you keep it at a very restrained kind of, so Johnny, how was your summer? Susan tells me that you spent a good time in your Boy Scout course, or what, or whatever it is, right? Like, it's this kind of like there's this base. It is. I think that this kind of attitude, if you think about not just the 1950s, but maybe more like the 1980s, like the Reagan era, and the point Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, I think, are great examples of this, because especially with Reagan, you consider that Reagan was a cowboy, country western, Hollywood star, right? And that in some way, the Reagan had this sort of performativity where he was like acting out his role as a president, and that even Margaret Thatcher was kind of like creating this sort of like public facade, or like the new Adam Curtis series is all about Thatcher and this sort of like creating this fantasy image, and having this sort of like managerial society where there's a false consciousness that's created. But Zizek would argue that it's precisely in order to make sure that it's actually a good thing that we have this. It's actually good. It's actually a necessary, like in the same way that Carl Jung would say that the point isn't to destroy the ego, to see beyond its illusion, but rather to the false. Even if there's something constructed or illusory about this one kind of consciousness, it's there to be able to conduct the necessary repression, so that you put your suit and tie on and you greet the customers, and you have this sort of false person. And then basically our society is structured so that Saturday night becomes the place, where the id gets to run free, basically, right? That you have to like repress all these parts of yourselves for your 9 to 5 or whatever it is job, and then you get the weekend is the time for the id, right? Now the problem is that the more and more that this sort of like strictly regimented structure of being a working employee who's clocking in all the time and has this one sliver of time for their shadow self to emerge and cause chaos and destruction. This is basically, as time goes on, people may find themselves in something like precarious gig work scenarios where they have work is sporadic, and that the old divisions between a false persona who is constructed for the sake of adapting to a managerial scenario is it becomes more of, Byung-Chul Han basically talks about this in Psychopolitics. It becomes internalized as your own internalization of these managerial psychodynamics, and instead of having a world of actual authority figures in the form of management, by liberating ourselves from that, we pay the price, first of all, for gig work that has less benefits in terms of like a dental plan or a health plan, or paid vacation time or something like this. Like, you don't have those frills, and then you don't have the friction of dealing with maybe some boss or manager that you don't get along with. But then you have to internalize that dynamic as a kind of your internalized manager structure, right? And that somehow you are constantly there's also this kind of attitude in the sense of like dealing with, I have to admit, I'm living with my family right now. I'm living with my mother and my sister, and there's this certain kind of like dealing with a parent figure versus dealing with a manager, and the way that regardless of actual parents and actual managers, that the idea that family systems incorporate kind of this management and this kind of false consciousness in the sake of like, you have to always be playing this sort of false ego and not talking about your authentic self or whatever. And then, but the thing is, it's just like, it starts to break down when there isn't actually the family of the people that have the really radical, like somebody's really far right, somebody's really far left, and they can't talk about it on the internet. It's like, that is actually just a historical thing from the past. Most of these people are dead right now, and now we're all atomized into people that are not. This is the kind of thing. It's like, it leads into the questions too, I think, about the male loneliness epidemic. And I'm just going to call out something about this because there could be different kinds of loneliness. There could be like the loneliness of living on your own in like a single room occupancy downtown apartment or something. But or else there's the loneliness of like sharing a space with roommates or housemates that you just sort of like they're not your best friends, but you kind of cooperate with these people, that you're not choosing to live with them on the basis of living with your best buddies or something like that. There could be like like the thing is that the idea is that if you're living with your family, technically you're not, or like, this is the whole thing. If you're actually, Carl Jung says this idea that loneliness is not about being surrounded by a lack of contact with people. It's about the inability to share the things that you are passionate about, or that you're inspired by, or that you feel like you have to have. The introvert, basically, Carl Jung came up with these ideas of introvert and extrovert. For Carl Jung, the introvert was somebody who had to internalize a lot of stuff because to them there was the external world, the extroverted world was something where you had to, because the ego is necessary, there's a certain necessity of false consciousness and performativity in the external world. And because the Marxist leftist kind of perspective, they use the word like social labor or emotional labor, right? There's a certain labor required if you have to suppress your emotions, you have to repress your opinions, you have to repress all these things that you would define as being authentic, right? So there's a certain kind of like labor in the performativity of like putting on the uniform, the suit and tie, and being friendly to all the customers, and suppressing the part of yourself that would then be the id that goes out in the weekend or something like that. There's something about the labor required to that the introvert finds the labor requirement of all that repression to be very draining. So it's like doing that you have like a video game character who has the health bar or the magic mana bar getting drained the more that they're performing these functions, and then they need to have all this alone time to do their own, maybe read some books or do some art or like do different creative projects to sort of restore their like inner world that gets drained by having to like repress itself and then perform a false social thing or whatever. Zizek completely disagrees with this because in a very kind of like because as from a materialist point of view, if there's this demand on you to if you have to, at the very bottom line, perform a certain kind of repression so that people get fed, clothed, have roofs over their head, everything goes smoothly, then this is a necessary repression, and that it's kind of like we can't. It's an illusion to think that the introvert's little inner world of making art and fantasy and stuff like that is authentic in contrast to what has to be done to basically make the bottom line to make everything work, right? But consider also the fact that there's in civilized society, what we have is a issue of surplus and as well as carrying capacity, right? Because all civilized agriculture societies basically operate on a surplus. They have a carrying capacity so that there is a excess of going beyond what is just the bottom line, basically, right? And it's within this sort of excess, or this sort of the surplus, that the fact that we have a certain access to abundance, that the falseness, the performativity, the costume, is there's something about it where it obviously it does play into this whole thing about bullshit jobs, right? A lot of people say there's this issue when it comes to the managerial class that because there's like a ladder climbing where it's just managers managing other managers, that somewhere along the ladder from the bottom to the top there are a lot of positions that become kind of redundant, and they really just exist to be a stepping stone to stratify people out for different pay raises, and it becomes a kind of a this is basically the criticism of the elites, is that there ends to be a kind of extractive process where there's a certain managerial class that seems to be kind of phony, right? And the phoniness, when it becomes to be apparent, the phoniness is there to keep a certain power arrangement in place. Another example of this I often think about is that I watched the Neil Gaiman Sandman series on Netflix a while back, and there's this one episode where they're all in a diner, and it's like the whole theme about it is like if everybody lost their ability to have this false consciousness, that this false consciousness is like necessary, or else people would all just be like screwing each over, cheating on one another, chaos would break out in the streets. But it's ironic in the context of, it's kind of like also this cancel culture thing, in the idea that like there's all this bad shit that goes on in the world, and yet in order to function, in order to keep the engine going, we have to have a certain kind, it's necessary to have this false consciousness, so that it's not like Knives Out or whatever, right? It's not like just open hostility, a Mexican standoff or whatever. It's that we can have a civilized world, and in some way democracy comes out of this, right? Because there's this idea that like what is accepted into the Overton window of liberalism is basically an ability to live in a free society where people are guaranteed the rights to have a free range of thought and opinions and beliefs and stuff like that, meaning that if you have the wrong belief or the wrong idea, you don't have to worry about it getting you killed, right? And so basically what tends to happen with the Overton window is that the most extreme forms of politics are excluded from liberal centrism, because if there's going to be open hostility and open violence, then that's outside of what we can do with democracy, right? If you're actually an outright hostile threat, then that has to be dealt with. That's why we have the police and the military to take care of that, right? So that all that kind of stuff that's at the level of that kind of hostility is dealt with by the police, the military, the legal system. And then so within this bubble of, we can agree that everybody is going to be able to have free speech, freedom of expression, freedom of a range of options of different ways of thinking. But if it's as so long as that doesn't mean that you're gonna be openly hostile in a violent way to exclude those freedoms of other people, right? So it's like things are open for conversation, but when it becomes a call to arms, you're an extremist, basically, right? So, but within those parameters, basically, we have the freedom of liberal democracy or a liberated society, but it starts to be very limited in scope when, in practice, when you want to exercise your freedoms, it's most of what you can do is limited by the free market, right? And this sort of creates the consumer identity as the kind of materialist liberal freedom, in that you can say anything you want, you can buy anything you want, but other than that, you feel kind of impotent and useless or whatever, right? Or that there's something about the circumstances of the world that we're faced with seem like it's kind of beyond anything that we have agential control over, or that we don't have a ability to participate in the structuring of society, right? And I think there's this basic kind of idea that like when you're children and you're growing up, that you have to have be educated and be taught about how the world works because you don't have enough understanding about all the dynamics or whatever. But there's this thing about like as grown adults that are we just beholden to the system the way it is, and that if there are structural problems, or I mean there's different also things, different levels of this that I could like look at it in terms of me as an individual and planning my own life or something like that, and having the ability to do things. But then at the other side, as a whole civilization, like are we able, and when we're faced with problems like climate change, and while I'm recording this, there's been a lot of the smoke has blown, the wind has blown the smoke into my area, so it's kind of on my mind in background ambience that this is the world that we're living, where we just have to expect forest fires and smoke all the time, and a reminder of all those climate issues or whatever. And that, do we as a free liberal society have the ability to look at the problems that we're faced with and implement solutions where we think of plan for the long term, and so, or are we just going to be like, let's just go crazy and just like go on vacation and like YOLO, right? Like millennial YOLO culture. You only live once. Let's just have a ball out blast and just go crazy and like party really hard because you only live once. And who cares about, this is like, it's kind of like, this is the world that you grow up in, is not like, it seems like growing up as a millennial in the 90s, there's this kind of flippant, kind of ignorant attitude where people just like don't give a shit about anything. And there's not really any I think maybe the consciousness that's coming online with these Gen Z kids is that they want to more intentionally structure a life rather than just to go like party and have fun and burn out and like not care about anything. They actually want to be like, wait a minute, well, if we have to like, but this hasn't sort of translated into an environmental consciousness for some reason, or it doesn't seem to like translate. It doesn't seem to like, they don't really connect the dots. But this is mainly because of the I guess it's just the money machine behind it all, right? I think this is basically part of the whole false consciousness thing, is that part of the false consciousness is you have to have the pretense that you have some sort of higher principle or something that you believe in, or something that justifies what you're doing as being right and good and just, other than basically opportunistically extracting profits wherever you can, right? And I think that this is one of the things that sort of like sort of made me kind of cynical to, or I don't know. I think there's something about the attitude of like business and money making that I'm not opposed to like money as a thing in principle, but there are certain problems with it, in that there's nothing I don't think there's inherently anything moral about the using money as a motivator, or using money itself or whatever is most profitable as how to prioritize what you think you're going to do, to how you're prioritizing your action, how you're prioritizing how you're spending your time and energy, right? Because oftentimes whatever is most profitable is the most exploitative, right? It's only profitable because there's a power imbalance where there's something here which is undervalued and something here which is overvalued, and you can find opportunistic ways to insert yourself in the gap and work the differential and profit off of it, basically, right? That's basically all there is to it. And if you can well, I don't know. I'm just kind of I'm gonna leave it here for now. It seems like my the sort of rhythm or the pace of what I'm just kind of freewheeling it. But this is my reaction, anyways, to the Nietzsche's aphorism number 365. I hope you enjoyed it. And I think it's sort of revealing, but you can sort of trace or a lot of this kind of stuff that became. It's like no coincidence that in the Matrix, the simulation is very corporate, gray office tower world, and I think that Nietzsche is kind of like prophetess here in the way that he's describing the sort of false consciousness that has become a kind of managerial class, corporate culture that came to prominence in the 1980s around politicians who themselves were actors, literally, right? Or that he kind of predicted Ronald Reagan even in this. It's like it's amazing. So thanks for watching.